No one saw the storm coming, not like that. Not even the old trappers who read the clouds like scripture. And by the time the first wagon was buried in snow and the first child froze to death clutching a wooden spoon, it was too late for most to run. That winter, 73 swallowed whole towns and stripped men to bone. But one man, far off beyond the timberline where the Bitter Creek bends, did something so strange, so quiet, no one knew about it till spring thaw. They said he vanished into the snow with his family, but they were wrong. He was digging, and what he dug saved them. His name was Elias Mercer, and he wasn't the kind to talk loud or gather much. He lived with his wife Clara and their 3 children, James, Hannah, and little Ruth, on a squat square of land near no neighbors, near no church, near no help. When his wife gave birth, he buried the placenta under a locust tree. When his youngest nearly drowned in the spring melt, he carved drainage trenches by hand till his palms split open. He didn't build for comfort, he built for staying. And when winter came down from the high granite ridges that year like a hawk folding wings, he didn't pray. He vanished behind his barn and started digging. He didn't tell Clara what it was for at first. She thought he'd lost his mind. "You think a hole in the dirt'll stop the cold?" she asked, her voice edged from weeks of boiled bark tea and cracked corn. Elias just kept working. Each morning before the frost lifted off the grass, he'd light a lantern and disappear out back. Some days she'd catch sight of him through the window, shirtless in the cold, sweat steaming off his back, moving soil like it owed him something. The children watched in silence, sometimes worried, sometimes curious, but they never asked. By the 3rd week of November, the sky lost its color. The air went gray and stayed that way. Snow came in sheets, fell thick as wool, and stayed heavy. The chimney smoked poorly no matter how hot the fire roared. Everything creaked, rafters, knees, bones, pipes cracked. The cellar turned brittle. They rationed meat down to sinew and bone. Elias came in one morning with his beard rimmed in frost and collapsed by the hearth. Clara crouched beside him, pulled off his boots, and found the soles of his feet blackening. "You need to stop," she told him that night, her voice nearly breaking. "We'll burn the last of the logs and stay by the stove. We'll take shifts. We'll survive." "No," he said so quiet she barely heard. "We won't." Then he showed her. It wasn't just a hole, it was a channel, 4 feet deep, stone-lined, running a tight loop under the earth beside the house. It turned and angled just right, not random, not careless. There were slats, supports, something like a trench built for soldiers, but buried deep with what looked like a vented stone cap along one edge. Elias, with nothing more than an old army spade and the back of his boot heel, had dug a kind of fire-fed draft tunnel beneath the home, fed from a pit near the barn. It angled up near the foundation and let out into the hearthstone, and at the base of it, beneath a slab of iron scavenged from a broken plough, he had laid dry kindling, coal bits, and a stub of lard-soaked rag. He called it the fire ditch. Clara didn't say a word for a long time. She looked down into the pit, looked up at him. She didn't ask how he'd known how to build it. She didn't ask if it was safe. The frost in her teeth and the purple in her children's fingers made such questions luxuries. That night, Elias lit the fire ditch. It didn't roar. It didn't crackle. It breathed. The warm air didn't come all at once. It slid along the floor like fog, rising in slow coils along the corners of the room, spreading warmth not from the chimney down, but from the dirt up. It felt unnatural. It felt like the ground itself had turned against the freeze. Clara sat with Ruth in her arms, rocking gently in disbelief as the girl's lips pinkened. James dropped his hat. Hannah laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. Elias didn't celebrate. He sat near the hearth, one hand on the stone, watching the smoke pull clean up the flue. There was something in his face, something scared, as if even he didn't quite believe it had worked. But it had. 2 nights later, the storm hit full. They'd thought it had already begun, but that was nothing. The real storm came like a bear against the walls. Howling wind, snow sideways, ice slamming the shutters like fists. The cold hit so fast, the windows frosted from the inside. Elias sealed the doors with sod, hung blankets from the rafters, checked the ditch twice that night, tending the pit, feeding the flame with twigs and bone scraps and old grease. He slept on the floor, curled against the stone. By morning, most cabins in the valley had gone cold. Even those with 2 stoves couldn't hold against the wind. Fires died from lack of draft. Families huddled in cellars, wrapped in rugs, their breath rising like ghosts. Elias's family sat in shirt sleeves, but the ditch required constant tending, twice a day, sometimes more. If the flame flickered too low, the warmth would fade, the smoke would slow, the draft would stall, and if the ditch filled with snow or water seeped in, it would choke. So Elias worked, every morning, every night, even when his hands cracked, even when Clara cried and begged him to rest. He worked, and then the neighbor came. His name was Ben Harker, lived 4 miles up the ridge, had a wife, 3 kids. His oldest had frostbite. His stove was out. He'd seen the smoke rise clean from Elias's flue and come dragging a sled through chest-high drifts, his beard frozen to his chest. He collapsed at the door, begged without words, just held out his hands and made a sound like a dying calf. Elias didn't hesitate. He hauled Ben inside, tore the boots off his feet, wrapped his hands in cloth. Clara heated broth. Ruth stood by the fire ditch's vent and waved to make the warmth rise. Ben slept for 2 days. When he woke, he asked how the house was warm. Elias didn't answer. Ben sat near the vent, tears running from cracked eyes. "My boy, he's gonna lose both feet," he said. "We dug pits, buried coals, burned the barn. Nothing held." Elias finally spoke. "It's the ditch." Ben blinked. "The what?" Elias just pointed at the floor. Ben Harker left the next morning with a sketch scrawled in charcoal on the back of a feed sack. A rough diagram, arrows, stone depths, flame tunnels. Elias didn't want to give it. Clara had begged him to keep it secret. But Elias had stared at Ben's ruined hands and said, "If your boy survives, build it." 3 days later, the ditch clogged. Ice. Elias tore it open with his bare hands, crawling half-naked into the snow pit, smoke in his face, digging with a ladle, using his own breath to melt a draft hole. He didn't come back in for hours. When he did, his eyebrows were gone, his nails black, but the heat was rising again. He didn't speak. Clara kissed his hand and wept, and still the snow kept falling. It was the 7th straight day without light. The wind had turned from howling to shrieking, a pitch that clawed through the ears and stayed in the bones. Ice lined the inside of the cabin's window panes like lace, thick enough to etch with a fingernail. The world beyond the walls no longer existed. It had become a hollow black nothing that whispered only of death. Elias Mercer hadn't slept longer than an hour at a time in 3 days. The fire ditch, as miraculous as it had proven, was not magic. It needed to be fed like an animal, hungry for flame, sensitive to suffocation. When the snow pressed down too fast, or a vent crusted shut with soot, it was as though the earth itself was trying to strangle the warmth back down into the ground. Elias fought it with ash-smeared hands and blistered palms, crawling back and forth between the fire pit out near the barn and the subtle chimney shafts that surfaced beneath the floorboards. Clara watched him from the door each time, saying nothing. Her heart turned over every time he vanished into the snowstorm. The children had stopped asking where he was going. They understood now. James, the oldest at 9, had taken to sitting near the main vent with a stick, nudging the airflow if it seemed weak. Hannah helped gather grease scraps from the root cellar. Ruth clutched Elias's coat sleeves at night and refused to sleep unless she felt his chest rise and fall beneath her fingers. The house was warm, warmer than any house had a right to be in that deadly freeze. But the warmth came at a cost no one could ignore. By the 9th day, the first body was found in the valley below. A trapper's wife, frozen mid-step, her mouth open like she'd been calling a name. Her husband had tried to walk to the river and return with fish. Neither of them made it back. The town hadn't had a mail delivery in nearly 3 weeks. Most of the roads were gone, buried under 10-foot drifts and iced ridgelines. No sled could pass. No horse could breathe in that cold. No man could cross the hills without succumbing to frostbite before he'd made it a mile. Most were stranded in place, shivering, desperate, and running out of wood. And still, smoke rose straight and steady from the Mercer's flue. It didn't take long for others to follow Ben Harker's path. The second came 2 days later. A woman named Mrs. Lanning, whose husband had perished trying to clear their roof. She arrived with her daughter, 7 years old, lips already blue. Elias opened the door, pulled them inside without hesitation, and let the girl sit directly over the ditch vent. The warmth curled up like a ghost and breathed life back into her little limbs. Clara boiled broth. Elias showed Mrs. Lanning the trench. She stood over it in silence, her hands shaking from more than the cold. "I've lived here 12 years, she whispered. "Never seen anything like this." Elias didn't reply. He was staring at the back wall, calculating something. In his head, he was always measuring the next failure before it happened. The trench's length, the weight of snow overhead, the rate at which wood burned in the pit, how many mouths the warmth could stretch to cover before the ditch became starved. By the 14th day, 2 more families had arrived. They didn't knock. They stumbled in, their eyes wild with windburn, carrying nothing but what they could lash to their backs. Children swaddled in wool and canvas, cheeks blistered, eyes dull. One man was dragging a wooden sled full of nothing but frozen shoes, and one broken axe head. When Elias saw the children, he didn't say a word. He began digging again. This time he extended the fire ditch. He and James, barely 9 but with hands that no longer shook, went out under cover of dark when the wind slowed to a bearable scream. They dug a second tunnel, parallel to the first, branching off like a vein from the heart of the main pit. It took 5 days. Elias lost 2 toenails to frost. He bled from the knuckles, but he kept going. Clara begged him to stop. The newcomers offered to help, but he refused. He didn't trust them with the angles, the slope, the precise stone placement that made the draft work. He'd memorized the flow like a priest reciting verses. It wasn't about heat, it was about breath. The ditch had to breathe. Inside, the cabin grew crowded. There were 12 now, 5 children, 7 adults. Floor space was gone. They slept shoulder to shoulder, like livestock. The ditch's warmth was spread thin, but it held, just barely. Clara rationed food with a flint knife, cutting bacon slivers so thin they curled. They boiled snow for water and used dried bark as tea. A baby was born in that room. Mrs. Lanning's niece had been pregnant, and hidden it out of shame. The birth was hard, loud, dangerous. Clara and one of the other women used strips of cloth and melted lard to help. The child came out silent, but the moment they held him over the vent, he gasped once and cried. They named him Elias. Outside, the snow grew so tall it buried the fence posts and pressed down on the roof like a living thing. Elias reinforced the eaves with salvaged timber. He carved a channel to run along the house's backside and drain meltwater safely. The ditch required more tending now. 3 tunnels, 3 access pits, a full rotation of fuel and airflow. He slept 4 hours across 2 nights. His hair went white at the temples. Clara watched his body shrink with every hour spent outside. One night, James caught him staring at the wall again, lips moving silently. "What are you doing, Pa?" the boy asked. Elias looked down. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin grey with soot. "Counting. Counting what? How many more I can let in before it kills us all." That same night, the 4th family arrived. The door burst open with a gust that knocked a lantern sideways. Snow spilled into the cabin, followed by 3 silhouettes. 2 men, 1 woman, carrying bundles wrapped in waxed canvas. They looked crazed, eyes darting like hunted animals. Their lips were cracked, faces raw. One man held a rusted hatchet. Clara stepped between them and the children. The other families rose. No one had weapons, but every hand went to a knife, a skillet, anything metal. "We saw the smoke," one of the men said. "You got heat, you got room." "No," Elias said, from the back of the room. His voice was dry, final. The man stepped forward. "You can't say no." "I can," Elias replied, "and I just did." The man with the hatchet took a step toward Clara. She didn't flinch. Elias crossed the room in 4 strides and punched the man so hard he dropped the weapon. The others jumped him. For a moment, the cabin erupted into chaos, screams, boots slamming against the wood, children crying. Then it stopped. Elias stood above them, bleeding from the lip, holding the hatchet. The 3 strangers were on the ground, wheezing. "Leave," he said. "Now! You'll kill us!" One spat. Elias said nothing. He just pointed to the door. They left, into the storm, into the black. No one slept that night. The silence afterward was worse than the fight. Clara wept. Ruth didn't let go of her father's leg until dawn. Hannah sat up against the wall, staring at the vent like it might vanish. Elias dug a 4th pit that morning, alone, not to extend the ditch, but to bury something. That afternoon, the first windbreak snapped. A side shaft to the fire ditch collapsed under the weight of melting snow and ash buildup. The draft began to slow. Heat dropped. James felt it first. He was playing with Ruth near the far wall when he noticed her breath started misting again. "Pa," he whispered, tugging Elias's sleeve. "It's dying." Elias didn't speak. He ran. Outside, the snow was slush. Dangerous. It meant melt, followed by freeze. Worse than powder. He fell 3 times before reaching the pit. Smoke billowed sideways instead of up. He ripped open the grate, shoved in dry splinters, sucked breath through the shaft like a man giving mouth to mouth. Then he crawled headfirst into the trench, shoulders scraping stone, and cleared it with his bare arms. He came out retching, black mucus, coughing blood. Clara pulled him inside and held him through the night. The heat returned, slower this time, but it returned. No one said a word about the fight. No one said a word about the bodies the wind might uncover in spring. No one asked what Elias would do if more came. They already knew the answer. As the storm entered its 3rd week, the snow turned silent. It no longer pelted. It simply fell, a steady weight, like ash from a fire no one could stop, and the ditch breathed. By the start of the 4th week, the storm had lost its fury, but not its grip. It was no longer the kind of storm that screamed. It was the kind that watched. The snow still came, quieter now, but constant, falling without rest, like the steady drip of water in a coffin. The cold had settled into a kind of permanence. not the sharp bite of a blizzard, but a slow, smothering chill that reached into everything, even the joints of the house itself. The Mercer's roof sagged in the middle. The barn had collapsed 3 nights prior, under the weight of snow so heavy it folded timber like bread. The fire pit was still functional, but only barely. Elias had reinforced it using a rusted door and a dozen stones from the creek, stacking it like a miniature fortress against the white world. Inside, the cabin looked like something from a war hospital. Blankets hung from rafters like surgery curtains. The dirt floor was padded with hay and rags to keep bare feet off the freeze. Men and women rotated watch shifts by the ditch vents, feeding the warmth with thin slivers of kindling and stirring airflow with flattened spoons. Babies cried less now, either because they were growing used to the cold or because they'd given up asking for something better. Elias hadn't spoken in 2 days. He moved like a machine, eyes glassy, mouth clamped tight. He no longer seemed aware of his surroundings, just the ditch, the pit, and the air. James followed him like a shadow, copying every motion. Once, Clara found her husband whispering to himself in the corner, fingering the soot lines along the inside of a collapsed vent. He was saying numbers, just numbers, over and over. She placed her hand on his shoulder, but he didn't blink. The visitors, those who'd come in from the storm, had long stopped asking for more. They cooked when asked, cleaned when told, and stayed near the vents, as though the ground might erupt if they moved too far. There was a reverence in how they looked at Elias now. He was no longer just a man. He was something else. Not a leader, not even a savior, a tether. As long as he breathed, the ditch breathed. As long as he moved, they lived. But it was Clara who first noticed the crack. She was pouring water into a clay pot near the main vent when she saw it, just beneath the far corner of the hearthstone, a thin black line like a hair on pale skin. At first she thought it was soot, but when she touched it, it felt warm, too warm, and when she pressed her palm to the stone, she felt it shift. She didn't scream. She didn't even call Elias right away. Instead, she waited until he returned from the pit and guided him to it with a look. He knelt slowly, his knees popping. The crack wasn't just a break in the stone. It was a sign. The pressure underground had changed. The draft was off. The flow was off. Something was wrong deeper down the line. He knew without needing to check. The second shaft was failing. Elias didn't hesitate. He bundled his coat, took the last of the pine tar-soaked rags from the drawer, and headed out into the dark. Clara followed him to the door. "It's too brittle out there. The snow's packed to the bone. You go digging into that, and it'll fall in on you." "If I don't," he said, barely audible. "This whole place is a coffin by morning." She didn't stop him. She just placed Ruth in his arms for a second. The girl was asleep. Her breath was warm against his collar. Then Clara took her back and stepped aside. Elias vanished into the cold. It was worse than before. The snow had compacted into slabs, ice-heavy, packed with the weight of weeks. The main shaft leading to the second branch was half-sealed, its air thin, the warmth barely venting. Elias began digging by hand, knowing that if he didn't reach the collapse within the hour, the draft would reverse. The smoke would back up into the house, the air would thicken, and the heat would die. He dug past feeling, past the sting of cold, past the shaking, past the bleeding. He reached the collapse just as the inner wall began to buckle inward, ice-cracking stone, pushing like a lung, exhaling in slow motion. He wedged his shoulders into the space and began clearing, one frozen scoop at a time, as the tunnel groaned like an old ship. Inside the cabin, Clara was boiling broth when the smoke started to change color. It was subtle at first, just a shift in how it curled up from the vent, how it lingered a second longer near the ceiling before rising. But Clara had seen that once before, 2 years ago when their first stove had backed up from poor draft and filled the house with invisible poison. She dropped the pot and ran to the ditch. "Get back," she shouted, yanking up the stone slab with both hands. Heat blasted her face. Too much heat. The flow was wrong. She grabbed a length of iron poker, crawled halfway down the shaft, and fanned the air desperately. "James," she shouted, Get him out!" James didn't wait. He threw on his coat and darted out into the black. Clara kept working the draft, praying it would hold. Behind her, one of the visiting men collapsed from the smoke. Another woman began to vomit. The children cried. Then the air shifted. Not fully, but enough. The flow reversed. Elias came crawling back into the pit 5 minutes later, his face gray, his eyebrows iced, his hands raw and shaking. James was behind him, hauling him by the coat. They pulled him into the cabin, stripped his clothes, and laid him by the ditch vent. For hours they thought he wouldn't wake, but he did. He opened one eye, looked at Clara and said, "It's open again." Then he slept for 3 straight days. The storm didn't stop, but it changed. On the 32nd day, the snow finally thinned. Not stopped, not lifted, just thinned, enough that the sun made its first dim appearance, like a dirty coin behind smoke, enough that the air lost its knifing edge, enough that, for the first time in a month, A man could walk 10 feet without tasting blood in his lungs. And with that change came noise, not the howling of wind or the creaking of frozen limbs, but shouting, voices. A group of men, half frozen, beards full of icicles, eyes wild, approached the Mercer cabin from the east trail. They were townsmen from Sycamore Ridge, the first Elias had seen in over a month. They knocked, and when Clara opened the door, they collapsed inside like men returning from war. They carried news. Sycamore Ridge was gone, burned, not by fire, but by desperation. When the storm's fourth wave came and the stove chimneys all choked with frost, the townsfolk had turned inward. Some tried to burn their floorboards, others turned on one another. A fight broke out at the general store. A woman smothered her newborn just to keep it quiet, and when it became clear there was no help coming, some gave up. They laid down and waited for death, but a few remembered a whisper, a story of a man who dug fire from the ground. They'd followed the smoke. The Mercer cabin was now shelter to 16 people, then 20. By day 40, there were 32 souls crammed into the cabin and its outbuildings, every crawl space, every nook warmed by the extending ditch. Elias had long since given up sleeping. He worked in rotations, directing others now. He showed men how to build secondary channels, how to vent properly, how to feed the fire with dried peat and crushed animal bone when wood was gone. He was no longer the only one maintaining the ditch. James took over one line. Clara supervised another. Ben Harker, who had returned with frost-bitten sons, now served as stoker for the eastern shaft. And still, the fire held. On the 45th day, something strange happened. The snow stopped completely. The air was still, like a held breath. Not warm, never warm, but not deadly. Just silence, pure and heavy. The next morning, the sun rose fully, and east, for the first time, the Mercer children stepped outside without boots sinking to the hip. The snow had settled to half its height. The roof no longer bowed. The trees shimmered instead of groaned, and far off, down the ridge, they could see smoke from another cabin. Thin, hopeful. Inside, Elias sat by the main vent, hands folded. He hadn't spoken in a day, just watched. Clara sat beside him. "They'll come," she said. He nodded. "And you'll help them." He didn't answer. She leaned against him. "We've made it, Elias." But he didn't believe it. Not yet. Because winter wasn't done. Not yet. The sun gave them 2 days. 2 days of deceptive light. Just enough to lure some of the newcomers into thinking the worst had passed. A few of the younger men began clearing the slope toward the creek, looking for firewood or downed branches they could drag back. Someone even mentioned hunting, but Elias knew better. He sat near the threshold of the fire pit chamber, elbows on knees, listening to the sounds beneath the snow, the subtle, hollow thumps and strange silences between wind gusts. He wasn't fooled. Winters this long never ended in a sigh. They ended in a crack, in a roar, in something violent and final. He had just stood to check the south vent, Ruth clinging to his coat as always, when the earth trembled. At first it seemed like someone had dropped something heavy, a muffled slam. But then it came again, deeper. Clara froze with her hand halfway to her mouth. Then came the third noise. Not a thump this time, but a distant groan, like trees twisting inside their own bark. Then quiet. A man named Dobbins, one of the Sycamore Ridge survivors, was halfway out the door when Elias shouted, "Stop!" But it was too late. There was a sound like thunder being sucked back into the ground, and then an avalanche broke loose from the southern ridge. Not snow falling off a ledge, not a roof collapse. The whole slope gave way. They saw it from the upper window, a tidal wave of white, snapping trees like twigs, rolling boulders, tearing fences and swallowing everything below. The sound was indescribable. It came from everywhere, above, below, inside the bones. Elias pulled Ruth and Clara to the floor as the cabin shuddered. Dirt sifted from the rafters. The outer shed, where 2 children had been playing near the straw bed, was buried in seconds. The air turned white. Screams vanished under the weight of snow and silence. Then, darkness. Elias clawed his way to the shed first. The snow was packed like stone. Every scoop a battle. He shouted over and over for the names of the children. James joined him, then Dobbins, then Clara. They used planks, bare hands, even one man's shattered boot to dig. They found the girl first, still breathing, then the boy, alive, but blue-lipped and shaking. Elias didn't speak. He scooped them both into his arms and stumbled back into the cabin. The others had gone silent, not from fear, but from understanding. They'd seen it too. The avalanche had missed the house only because of the ridge's angle. Barely. 10 feet closer, and they'd have been entombed. "Now, do you believe me?" Elias said, not shouting, not angry, just tired. "It's not over." That night, they sealed the doors. All of them. No more sending men out for firewood. No more venturing to the barn ruins. Elias ordered the last extension of the fire ditch, northward, toward the old outhouse where a pocket of frozen bark had been stored. It was a desperate gamble. If the tunnel collapsed now, there would be no time to dig another. He began work before dawn, dragging stones from beneath the cabin floor, tearing up his own foundation. Clara didn't argue this time. No one did. The ditch wasn't just a source of warmth anymore. It was the only structure that still worked, the only thing that moved when everything else froze. By the 50th day, the Mercer home was no longer just a cabin. It was a subterranean engine of survival. The fire ditch now had 5 separate lines: north, east, southeast, and 2 venting points at opposite ends of the room. Elias had mapped them in soot along the inside wall, tracing routes, scribbling notes, updating airflow metrics like a field marshal on campaign. The men called him the ditch master behind his back, not as a joke, as respect. Children began speaking again. Not much, but enough. They played near the main vent with carved bits of kindling. They mimicked Elias, pretending to check the airflow or tap the stones like engineers. Once Ruth built her own ditch out of wool scraps and set her doll beside it. Elias watched from the corner. Something between a smile and a sob caught in his throat, but food was now a whisper. They'd run out of salt pork 2 weeks ago. The last of the flour had gone to make a lumpy soup that barely passed for gruel. The root cellar, though insulated by snow, was nearly bare. Half-frozen potatoes, some dried peas, and 1 sack of oat husks. Clara began grinding pine bark and mixing it with melted snow to stretch out a broth. Children were given the most. Adults fasted. Then, on the 55th day, the second death came. An old man named Wright. He'd made it from a cabin 5 miles south, dragging a sled for 3 days. His hands had gone black before he arrived. They'd done their best, wrapped him, warmed him, but he never spoke a word. Not one, and one morning they found him cold near the back wall, his breath gone. Elias stood beside him for a long time. Then he took a shovel and began digging behind the cabin wall, in the snow pit just beside the collapsed barn. He buried Wright under a foot of ash and laid 3 stones atop the mound. Then he went back inside and added 1 more mark to the wall, a tally, not names. Just a line. That night a child coughed. Not a dry cough. Wet. Deep. Clara froze. She hadn't heard that sound in weeks. It was Hannah. Her face was red. Eyes watery. A fever. Clara pressed a hand to her neck and knew it instantly. Pneumonia, or something close to it. She'd been too close to the side vent during one of the collapses. Elias brought water. Lukewarm now, since the fire pit was burning low, and Clara tried to soothe her with cloth and balm scraped from old mint jars. But Hannah didn't sleep that night. She gasped, cried, then shook. There were no doctors, no medicine, just the fire ditch. Elias didn't sleep either. He sat beside her all night, feeding the north vent, whispering nonsense. He hadn't prayed since he was a boy, but that night he did, not to any name, just to the warmth, to the ditch. And when morning came, Hannah was still breathing, barely. On the 56th day, the first warm wind came. No one noticed it at first. It wasn't dramatic, just a shift, the kind of breeze that didn't burn, the kind that moved across skin without slicing. The trees dripped. Somewhere beyond the hills, a crow called, and people stepped outside. What they saw was a world misshapen by suffering, trees bent wrong, cabins half-eaten, carcasses of animals that hadn't made it through the snow, frozen mid-motion. The path to the creek was unrecognizable, but there were birds again, 2 of them, small, black-winged, hopping on a branch near the shed ruins. Inside, Hannah sat up. She was weak, pale, but alive. Clara wept. Elias stood at the hearth and looked down into the vent. The warmth still rose, thin now, but steady. He touched the stones. They were slick with thaw. Then came the knock. Not a bang, not a desperate pounding, just a slow, patient knock on the door. Everyone froze. Elias opened it. 2 riders, lean, frostbitten, eyes sunken, but alive. One wore a marshal's badge. The other held a satchel with the federal postmark half ripped off. They'd come from the east, Bear Creek Junction, 30 miles. The thaw had opened a path. They were checking for survivors. The marshal looked around, stepping inside, and stopped cold. He stared at the packed room, the soot-covered vents, the 5 branches of the fire ditch, the sleeping children curled near warmth coming from the ground. "My God," he muttered. "How?" No one answered. They didn't have to. He stayed the night, took notes, promised to return with supplies. And before he left, he asked Elias one question. "Did you invent this?" Elias stared at the vent. "No," he said. "I just listened to the earth." The marshal nodded. "Well, whatever you did, it saved these people." Elias didn't speak. He was already walking toward the fire pit again, toward the next repair. The ditch was still breathing after all, and so were they. The thaw didn't come like a curtain lifting. It came in pieces, fragile, uncertain, like a wounded man learning how to stand again. The sky softened first, giving up its color by degrees. The nights grew quieter, not because the cold was gone, but because the wind no longer screamed. The snow stopped falling, and in its place came fog, heavy and wet, as if the sky itself was weeping over what it had done. Elias Mercer stood alone near the fire pit, boots sunk into slush, his fingers black with soot and ash. The fire ditch still breathed, but its exhale was shallow now, the heat no longer vital, just residual. He'd kept it alive for 62 days, fed it like a child, buried the old stone vent when it cracked, built new tunnels in the middle of the night when others would have frozen trying to think straight. Now he stared at it like an old friend he might not need anymore, but couldn't bring himself to leave behind. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of pine tar and broth. Clara stirred a pot of bark-thickened stew, while Hannah lay sleeping near the hearth, cheeks flushed with life. Ruth was on her lap. James sat with a pencil in hand, carefully sketching a diagram Elias had drawn on the wall in soot weeks ago, a crude but brilliant design that now bore 5 interconnected lines, each branching and curling like roots under a tree. At the bottom, Elias had scribbled a word in crooked, nearly illegible print: breathe. The marshal had returned that morning, bringing with him 3 more riders and 2 wagons carrying sacks of flour, salted meat, beans, dried fruit, and medicines that smelled sharp and bitter, and came in little tins marked with official stamps. He didn't ask many questions this time. He just watched the way Elias moved through the cabin, how others followed him, not out of command but trust, how every child's gaze settled on him the way starving men looked at firelight. They were alive because of a hole in the ground, but the world outside had changed. The marshal reported over 24 cabins wiped out within a 20-mile radius, entire families gone. Some had died in their sleep, others frozen mid-step between homes. One town had collapsed entirely, its last residents found in the church, where they'd burned the pews for warmth and sat huddled around the altar, waiting for a salvation that never came. Others had made it to low caves, crude shelters, animal dens. A few, the lucky few, had heard whispers about a man in the northern hills who'd made fire run through the ground, and now they came, in 2s and 3s, wrapped in canvas and rags. With sleds and frost-bitten feet, they trickled toward the Mercer homestead like animals to a watering hole. Word had spread faster than spring itself. The man with the fire ditch had saved over 30 people through the worst winter the territory had ever recorded. Elias didn't ask them where they came from. He didn't ask what they needed. He just pointed to the shed, now reinforced with stone and straw, and told them to rest. The warmth from the ditch didn't reach that far anymore, but it didn't need to. The worst had passed. One night, as the children slept and the newcomers huddled near the cabin walls, Elias stepped out into the melting dark. Clara followed him. The air smelled of wet wood and old death. Somewhere in the trees, a carcass thawed. Somewhere closer, a fox barked. "You're limping more," she said. Elias grunted. "Old snow finds the cracks in a man. You should let others tend the pit." "I don't need to tend it anymore." Clara watched him, the way his eyes drifted to the black opening in the snow where the main fire tunnel used to breathe. Now it was still a scar. "Are you going to close it?" she asked. "No," Elias said. "I want it to be there, so folks don't forget." She said nothing, just took his hand. They stood there, quiet, as the frost began to rise from the ground in tendrils. By the time the snow had receded to the creek beds and the frost came only at night, Elias had become something of a legend. People began arriving just to see the ditch. Some came from Bear Creek, others from farther, Scottsfield, Grey Hollow. A reporter showed up with a sketch pad and thick city gloves, asking questions Elias refused to answer. When pressed, he handed her a diagram James had redrawn, neater this time, with labels: fuel chamber, main shaft, draft slope, stone cap, intake angle. She left with a promise to print the story in the next edition of the Territory Ledger. The diagram would later circulate among farmers, trappers, and outposts across the high frontier. It would inspire knockoff versions in Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. Most failed, but some worked. Not all could explain why, but they all traced back to Elias Mercer's design. One day, a man arrived with a satchel full of tools and asked Elias to come with him to the capital. "They want to build it bigger, stronger, beneath schools maybe, churches. We've never seen anything like it." Elias shook his head. "I built it so my daughter wouldn't die on the floor." The man blinked. "But it could change things." Elias stared at him. "Then you build it, you dig it, you tend it. You stay up nights feeding it your skin and your blood and your last spoon of fat when everything else is dead. And when it breathes like a newborn, and you keep 30 souls alive through the storm, you can name it. I don't care, but I'm not leaving my home." The man left, and Elias went back to work. The final weeks of thaw were strange. There was no celebration, just a slow, exhausted exhale. When the ground showed brown again and birds returned to the trees, no one cheered. They just started walking home, or what was left of it. The ones who had cabins still standing returned. The ones who didn't stayed. The Mercer home grew by 3 more rooms that spring, built by the hands of those it had once saved. The fire ditch was reinforced with brick and timber, and became a permanent fixture, no longer a desperate experiment, but a living monument. James kept a journal, detailing everything he'd seen, everything Elias had taught him. Ruth would sometimes sit near the main vent and pretend to whisper secrets into the stone, and Hannah grew stronger every day. One day in late April, Elias took James and walked him down the entire length of the ditch, every shaft, every angle, every capstone. "You remember this," he said, "not just how it's built. Why, don't let the next one catch you sleeping." James nodded. He wouldn't forget. That night, Clara lit the stove, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The cabin was warm now without help. The sun had returned. The earth had softened. But still, the ditch breathed, just faintly, just enough. Elias sat by the hearth, a cup of weak coffee in hand, watching his children sleep. He hadn't slept well in months. But tonight, maybe tonight, because outside the stars had returned, and beneath the floor, deep and low, the fire ditch still whispered the only word Elias had ever truly trusted: breathe.